Judy collapsed behind a locked door. Marilyn was left alone, and on another set, they were poisoned by the sand that was still radioactive. These are 17 stars, 17 endings the studio never wanted you to see. The Conqueror Cluster, the movie that may have killed half its cast. In 1956, The Conqueror hit theaters with the force of a Hollywood epic. John Wayne as Genghis Khan, Susan Hayward as his love interest, and a Utah desert standing in for Mongolia. But what no one knew then was that the real disaster wasn't in the box office. It was buried beneath the sand. The film was shot near St. George, Utah, just downwind from the Nevada test site, where the U.S. government had detonated dozens of nuclear weapons only a few years prior. Locals knew the winds carried something foul. Radiation warnings were whispered, then shrugged off. The studio? They trucked in more dirt from the fallout zone to build artificial hills on set. Some of it was still radioactive. By the early 1960s, people started dying. Susan Hayward, Agnes Moorehead, Pedro Armendariz, director Dick Powell, John Wayne, all from various forms of cancer, many rare, aggressive, and diagnosed young. At least 91 crew members would eventually be diagnosed, nearly half the cast and crew. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Unless you had a studio to protect, the government denied responsibility. Studios never issued a warning, and Hollywood moved on. But behind the scenes, something darker lingered. The quiet horror of people realizing their death sentence may have been signed the day they showed up on set. Pedro Armendariz, facing a brutal diagnosis, reportedly took his own life before the disease could finish the job. Others fought publicly. Wayne had his lungs removed. Hayward's battle was long and painful. Each death was another dot on a map no one wanted to draw. The tragedy wasn't just the sickness, it was the silence. No class action suit, no official acknowledgement. Just whispers across backlots and late-night phone calls, as survivors compared diagnoses like they were reading lines from the same doomed script. The Conqueror was supposed to be a Hollywood spectacle, but it became a radioactive ghost story. A cursed production not from superstition, but science ignored. In chasing cinematic glory, they stepped onto poisoned ground, and by the time the credits rolled, the real damage had only just begun. Judy Garland, the voice they dressed in chains. In 1969, a London bathroom door wouldn't open. On the other side was Judy Garland, unresponsive, alone, and far from the yellow brick road. To the world, she was Dorothy, eternal, bright-eyed, and full of wonder. But behind the curtain, Judy lived a different script, one written not in dreams, but in demands. From the time she was just a child, the studio system had claimed her. They trimmed her body, altered her voice, and fed her pills to keep her working. Then more pills to make her sleep. Hollywood gave her fame, but never rest. By her teens, Judy was running on borrowed time. Insomnia, exhaustion, and relentless image control became her daily reality. Studio executives allegedly tracked her weight with a scale more closely than they followed her performances. When she wept from fatigue, they handed her something to take. When she lost her spark, they gave her something stronger. And always, the cameras kept rolling. Her adult years were no gentler. Failed marriages, financial ruin, and relentless touring became her survival strategy. Garland once sang to sold-out crowds with a trembling voice and bleeding feet. Too proud to cancel, too desperate to stop. Those who loved her said she was chasing a stage that no longer loved her back. Then came that night in June. The autopsy report listed a fatal mix of barbiturates, and the coroner called it an incautious self-overdosage. Officially accidental. But it didn't take long for fans to ask deeper questions. Why had no one intervened? Why did her hotel suite show signs of ongoing distress? Why, despite years of public decline, had no one truly helped her step away? Later, the examiner clarified that Garland had been taking pills for so long, her body simply couldn't keep the rhythm anymore. There was no sign of alcohol, no grand collapse. just a slow unraveling. A woman worn thin by decades of forced performance. She died at 47, still trying to please, still trying to be enough. In the end, the tragedy wasn't that Judy Garland faded, it's that Hollywood burned her too brightly, then left her in the dark. Marilyn Monroe, the star who was brighter than her ending. In the summer of 1962, the most photographed woman in the world was found alone, silent, and unreachable, behind a locked door. The same lips that once sang "Happy Birthday" to the president were now still, and the world held its breath. She was fame, a fragile icon wrapped in satin, adored and desired across the globe, yet quietly unraveling in the shadows of her own spotlight. By the time of her passing at age 36, Marilyn had become something more than a person. She was a myth, a muse, and a mirror, reflecting everything Hollywood promised, and everything it never gave. That morning in August, her housekeeper noticed the bedroom light still on. Hours passed, no sound. When the door was finally opened, Marilyn was found in her bed, unconscious and unresponsive. A tragic still life surrounded by scattered pill bottles and worry-stained whispers. The coroner's official report ruled it a probable self-administered case, citing a lethal mix of prescription sedatives. But the story didn't end there. Within hours, rumors erupted like flashbulbs. Why did it take so long to call the police? Why had her phone records vanished? Why were early reports revised and then sealed? Whispers tied her to the White House, to men of power, to secrets that never made it into scripts. Some claimed she had tried to call for help, just like in past spirals, but this time no one picked up. A psychiatric team later reviewed her final days, and their words still haunt the page. She had often expressed wishes to withdraw, even to die. They concluded she didn't plan it like a script, but simply fell into the same pattern she had before. The difference was, this time, there was no rescue. In the end, Marilyn's death was treated like the roles she was too often given: beautiful, tragic, and misunderstood. But beneath the headlines, she was a woman worn thin by fame, clinging to meaning in a town that sold illusions. She once said, "I just want to be wonderful," and perhaps she was, just not in the way they expected. Elvis Presley, the king who couldn't escape his kingdom. On August 16, 1977, the music stopped. Graceland fell quiet, and a man who once made the world scream with joy was found silent on the bathroom floor. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was gone at just 42. To his millions of fans, Elvis was immortal. He had swagger, soul, and a voice that bent time. But behind the white jumpsuits and sold-out shows, the king was losing his throne one quiet collapse at a time. The official report pointed to heart failure, but deeper in the files, and in the silence of those who knew him, was a more tangled truth. Years before his passing, Elvis had begun to change. His once sculpted frame grew heavier. His vibrant performances turned sluggish. Some chalked it up to age. Others knew better. Behind closed doors, Elvis had reportedly relied on a cocktail of medications, prescribed liberally by those meant to protect him. Sleep aids, pain relievers, mood stabilizers, taken in amounts that would shake most men. But for Elvis, they were simply routine. His doctor, nicknamed Dr. Feelgood behind the scenes, had become a fixture in the Presley circle. More pharmacist than physician, and the pressures only mounted. Constant touring, tabloid rumors, a public that never allowed him to rest. Elvis, the man, was barely visible behind the merchandise. When the final report was filed, it noted a long list of substances present in his system. No single cause, just a gradual surrender. A body worn down by years of strain and quiet battles. Some say his heart gave out. Others believe it was Hollywood's machine, revving him up, dressing him up, and then driving him to the edge. And yet, he never stopped trying. Even in his final shows, you can hear it, the yearning in his voice, the hunger to still matter. He sang like a man chasing his own echo. In the end, Elvis didn't die a rock star. He died a prisoner of his own legend. Jean Harlow, the blonde bombshell who burned too bright. In June of 1937, MGM's Golden Girl lay in bed, her body swelling, her breath shallow, and her skin turned strangely gray. Jean Harlow, the original platinum blonde, the woman who made men stammer and cameras fall in love, was just 26. To the public, she was untouchable. Harlow wasn't just a sex symbol. She was lightning in satin. Her laugh lit up sound stages, and her films shattered box office records. But behind the polish was a woman privately crying out for help. In the weeks before her death, friends noticed something was off. She'd become lethargic, her face puffy, her breath heavy with an odd scent. She joked about being tired, but the truth was far more serious. Doctors initially brushed off her symptoms, blaming the flu, gallbladder trouble, or exhaustion, but Harlow's condition worsened by the hour. By the time she was admitted to the hospital, her kidneys were already failing. She slipped into a coma. Days later, she was gone. The official cause was listed as acute nephritis, a sudden and catastrophic inflammation of the kidneys. But questions lingered. Why had treatment come so late? And could her glamorous image, the platinum hair, the signature glow, have played a role in her downfall? Decades later, experts began to suspect that the chemicals used to bleach her hair may have slowly poisoned her. In the 1930s, going platinum wasn't a trip to the salon. It meant soaking her scalp in a mixture of ammonia, peroxide, Clorox, and soap flakes, week after week. Her hairstylist later admitted it was like bathing her head in acid. The irony was cruel. The very look that made Jean Harlow a legend may have also taken her life. She was buried in a white gown, with a white gardenia in her hand. MGM halted production across the lot in her honor. Clark Gable, who adored her, reportedly never got over the loss. Jean Harlow died before she had a chance to grow old, but perhaps that's why the image remains frozen. Youthful, brilliant, untouched by time. They called her the baby face with the body of a goddess, but it was her soul that Hollywood never truly understood until it was too late. Dorothy Dandridge, the beauty Hollywood, applauded, then abandoned. In September of 1965, a friend knocked on the door of Dorothy Dandridge's apartment. Inside, the lights were on, but Dorothy didn't answer. She was found alone, still, cold, and far from the stages that once adored her. Decades earlier, she had made history. In 1954, Dorothy became the first black woman nominated for an Academy Award in a leading role, a feat the industry clapped for, but never truly rewarded. She was elegance, talent, and dignity wrapped in satin. But behind the applause was a woman battling forces far bigger than herself. Hollywood liked to praise her beauty, but not cast her. Scripts offered stereotypes or silence. While her white co-stars moved from role to role, Dorothy found herself boxed in, tokenized, or ignored. She smiled for the cameras, but off-screen, she was fighting for custody of her daughter, a child with severe disabilities whom Dorothy couldn't afford to care for. It broke her, and she never forgave herself. She tried to stay afloat, sang in nightclubs, posed for photos, lived paycheck to paycheck. But her name, once lit up in gold, became a whisper. By the mid-1960s, Dorothy was struggling to stay visible and stay stable. Friends described her as weary, isolated, and increasingly reliant on pills to sleep, to perform, to forget. When she died at just 42, the coroner first claimed it was a rare embolism caused by a bone fragment traveling through her bloodstream. But that report was later retracted. After pressure from the media, the real cause was released, a fatal mix of prescription sedatives. Even in death, there was confusion, conflicting autopsy notes, medical oversights, the kind of errors that happen when someone's stardom fades before their heartbeat does. Dorothy once said, "If a human being can be haunted, maybe that would be me." It wasn't just a metaphor. She carried the weight of being first, without the protection of being supported. She died alone, but she wasn't empty. She had changed the rules, And though the industry let her down, history has begun to remember her not as a victim, but as a pioneer, a trailblazer with bruised wings, still soaring in memory. William Holden, the leading man who slipped through the cracks. In November of 1981, William Holden was found days too late. The man who once lit up screens with rugged charm and quiet gravitas had died alone. Not on a set, not on stage, but on the floor of his apartment. The phone just a few feet away. To the public, Holden was Hollywood's man's man. Tough, intelligent, steady. From Sunset Boulevard to Bridge on the River Kwai, he commanded attention without ever begging for it. He wasn't flashy, he was timeless. But time has a way of creeping in when the lights fade. In private, Holden had grown increasingly withdrawn. Though still respected in the industry, he had been quietly battling personal demons. Close friends noted his drinking had worsened, a slow, steady slide into habits he once controlled. Studios knew, but they also knew how to look the other way. He was still working, still delivering, so no one asked too many questions. What makes his death all the more haunting is the simplicity of it. According to the coroner's report, Holden tripped over a rug in his bedroom, struck his head on a nearby table, and never regained consciousness. He lay there for days. The official cause, blunt laceration of the scalp, leading to fatal blood loss. He had a high blood alcohol level at the time, enough to dull his senses, but not enough to dull the heartbreak of how quietly it all ended. When the news broke, the world was stunned. President Ronald Reagan, a longtime friend, issued a personal statement. But behind the condolences was a cruel irony. The man who once stood shoulder to shoulder with legends had vanished from life unnoticed. Holden had no grand scandal, no tabloid meltdown, just a slow erosion. The kind that happens when the applause stops, and no one teaches you how to be ordinary again. His ashes were scattered in the Pacific Ocean. No funeral, no fanfare, just waves. Sometimes, the saddest stories are the quietest. William Holden didn't fall from grace. He slipped through it, slowly, until no one was looking. And that's how he was lost. Jayne Mansfield, the blonde bombshell who became a legend of rumor. It was just past 2 a.m. on a Louisiana highway in 1967 when headlights cut through the fog and fate changed forever. Jayne Mansfield, actress, model, and one of Hollywood's most recognizable blonde bombshells, was riding in the front seat. Minutes later, the car collided with a tractor trailer. The crash was instant. The aftermath? A myth that would outlive her. Jayne wasn't just another pretty face. She was a calculated force, one who understood publicity like few others. She knew how to make cameras chase her. She had 5 children, spoke 5 languages, and held a theater degree. But the public rarely looked beyond the curves and the headlines. By the late 1960s, the roles had slowed. Some called her a Marilyn knockoff. Studios offered less, so Jayne leaned harder into shock, spectacle, and bold appearances. Anything to stay seen. But the accident that claimed her life would ensure she'd never be forgotten. She was traveling with her lawyer and boyfriend, along with 3 of her children, including a young Mariska Hargitay, who survived in the back seat. The car struck the back of a slow-moving truck, and tragedy unfolded in seconds. Early reports claimed Jayne was decapitated, a rumor fueled by crash scene photos showing her wig tossed from the vehicle. But her death certificate told a different story. It listed crushed skull with brain injury as the cause. The rumor, it turns out, wasn't just wrong, it was a grotesque exaggeration. One that has haunted her legacy far more than her body of work. And yet, Jayne had always been more than the roles she was given, more than the press called her, more than the tragic image they froze in time. In death, she became a cautionary tale of fame that burns fast and spectacle that can't protect you from reality. But look deeper, and there's something more. Jayne Mansfield never waited for permission. She built her brand, lived boldly, and fought for relevance in a system that wanted her quiet. She died young, just 34, but never faded. Because, for better or worse, Jayne knew exactly how to be remembered. Natalie Wood, the starlet lost at sea. On a cold November night in 1981, the ocean swallowed more than just a Hollywood star. It swallowed the truth. Natalie Wood was one of the most luminous faces of her time. From child stardom to rebel without a cause to West Side Story, she glided between innocence and allure like few others could. But fame rarely offers safety. And for Natalie, the final act of her life unfolded not under studio lights, but beneath a black sky, aboard a yacht named Splendor. She had been sailing off Catalina Island with her husband, Robert Wagner, her co-star Christopher Walken, and the yacht's captain. What happened that night has never been fully explained. What we do know is that Natalie disappeared sometime after midnight. Hours later, her body was found floating in the water, her coat soaked, a dinghy adrift nearby. At first, it was called an accident. The original report stated that she had likely slipped while trying to secure the dinghy, then drowned. But those who knew her weren't convinced. Natalie had a lifelong fear of dark water. She wouldn't have climbed into a boat alone, barefoot, in the middle of the night. Something didn't add up. In 2011, the case was reopened, and when investigators returned to the original autopsy, they noticed what had been overlooked: numerous fresh bruises on her wrists, legs, and forearms. Some experts suggested they occurred before she entered the water. Others weren't so sure. Even more troubling, her fingernails had never been checked for signs of a struggle. Robert Wagner, once listed as a witness, was later named a person of interest, but no charges were ever filed. Walken remained silent, and with every passing year, the fog thickened. Natalie's final moments remain a haunting riddle. Was it an accident? A fight gone too far? Or something darker? Protected by power and fear? What makes her story so tragic isn't just that we lost her, it's that we still don't know how. A woman who spent her life in front of cameras vanished in the one place no one could film. And in the end, the sea kept its secrets. Sal Mineo, the rebel whose comeback was cut short. In February of 1976, Sal Mineo stepped out of his car after a late-night rehearsal, scripts under one arm, keys in the other. Within seconds, the quiet street echoed with shouting, then silence. He collapsed just feet from his West Hollywood apartment, a rising star extinguished during his return to the spotlight. Mineo was more than the sensitive sidekick in Rebel Without a Cause. He was a rarity, a young actor who burned with intensity and vulnerability in equal measure. At just 19, he earned an Academy Award nomination and was hailed as the next big thing. But Hollywood is fickle, especially to those who don't fit its mold. By the mid-60s, the roles had dried up. Whispers circulated about his personal life, and casting agents turned cold. Mineo, once on magazine covers, was now stuck performing in dinner theaters and regional plays. But he didn't stop. He kept working, quietly clawing his way back toward respect. When he landed a serious role in a new stage production, insiders called it his second act. That second act never opened. The official report was grim but simple. A single stab wound, fatal. The scene suggested it was a robbery, but it felt far more targeted. Witnesses saw the attacker flee into the dark, but the trail went cold. For 2 years, it wasn't until someone across the country reportedly bragged about the killing that police connected the dots. The man was arrested, tried, and convicted, but the full motive remained murky. After his death, the tone shifted. Directors who once ignored him praised his brilliance. Obituaries referenced his loyalty, his warmth, and the comeback he had nearly pulled off. But for Sal, it was too late. The curtain had fallen, not by accident, but by violence. He was 37, alone, rehearsing for a role he never got to play. The most tragic part? He had already made it through the storm. He had faced the rejection, the rumors, the long nights without calls. And just when the light returned, the door never opened. Sal Mineo wasn't just a lost actor. He was a symbol of how fragile redemption can be and how quickly it can vanish. Lucille Ball, the queen of comedy who faced a silent emergency. In April of 1989, the woman who made the world laugh with wild expressions and slapstick timing faced something no punchline could soften: a sudden, catastrophic tear deep within her chest. Lucille Ball, the face of I Love Lucy, died not with a laugh track, but in a sterile hospital room, surrounded by blinking machines. To most, Lucille was eternal. Her legacy stretched across generations, from the early black-and-white television era into syndication immortality. She wasn't just America's sweetheart, she was its laughter. But behind the red hair and famous cackle was a woman of intense drive, ambition, and control. Someone who had fought tooth and nail to rise above the era's expectations for women in entertainment. Lucille had spent her life in motion, acting, producing, running Desilu Studios, breaking ground for female executives in a male-dominated town. But age slows even the most relentless, and by her late 70s, health concerns had quietly begun to surface. Still, she kept going. Then came emergency heart surgery. She made it through, barely, a triumph that made headlines. But just days later, something ruptured inside her. The autopsy revealed an acute dissection of the aorta. Essentially, her heart's inner lining had torn apart. It's a rare, sudden event with almost no warning. And in Lucille's case, it occurred in a separate section of her aorta than where the doctors had operated. Despite 47 minutes of life-saving attempts, she never regained consciousness. The official documents confirmed what fans already feared. Lucille Ball was gone at 77. The woman who had given so much life had slipped away quietly. What struck many wasn't just the shock of her passing. It was how fast, how random, how final it all was. She hadn't faded with illness or scandal or fame gone sour. She had simply been here, vibrant, sharp, still Lucille. And then she wasn't. Even in death, she defied the script. Lucille Ball spent her career making people forget their problems, if only for 30 minutes at a time. But behind the laughter was a titan, one who carried the weight of comedy, business, and legacy until her very last heartbeat. She didn't just break barriers, she rewrote the blueprint and then vanished without fanfare. Carole Lombard, the star who fell from the sky. In January of 1942, the country was bracing for war, and Hollywood was doing its part to lift morale. Carole Lombard, beloved screwball queen with razor wit and a megawatt smile, had just completed a war bond tour. She raised over $2 million in a single night. Then she boarded a plane home. She never made it. To the public, Carole was all light and laughter, the quick-talking darling of comedies like My Man Godfrey, and the fierce, real-life partner of Clark Gable. But beneath the fast-talking charm was a woman deeply patriotic and determined to help her country, even as danger loomed in the skies. On January 16th, she boarded TWA Flight 3 with her mother and press agent. They never reached Los Angeles. Somewhere over Nevada, the plane crashed into the side of Mount Potosi. There were no survivors. The details that followed were haunting. Lombard's remains were recovered near the wreckage. Her body burned beyond recognition. The official report listed the cause of death as multiple traumatic injuries and third-degree burns, a stark contrast to the vitality she'd shown just hours before. The crash was blamed on pilot error and a failure to account for a nearby mountain range in low visibility. But rumors swirled for years. Some whispered of sabotage, others of ignored warnings. What was certain? The world had lost one of its brightest stars. Her husband, Clark Gable, was shattered. He rushed to the scene, climbed the mountain, and waited for news that never came. Days later, he enlisted in the Army Air Forces, not as a publicity stunt, but as a man chasing meaning through grief. The war had taken his wife, and he was determined to fight back. Lombard was just 33 years old. Her death wasn't shrouded in scandal or whispered in studios. It was loud, public. And cruelly ironic, she had been trying to do good, to inspire hope. Instead, she became one of America's first celebrity casualties of the war effort. Carole Lombard died a heroine, not on a film set, but in the service of something larger than herself. She made them laugh. She made them cheer. And in the end, she gave everything. Bruce Lee, the dragon who left without warning. On July 20th, 1973, Bruce Lee lay unconscious in a Hong Kong apartment, never to wake again. The man who moved like lightning, who defied gravity on screen and embodied pure willpower, was suddenly still. He was 32. To the world, Bruce wasn't just a martial artist. He was a revolution in motion, a philosopher in muscle and bone. He broke through Hollywood's racial barriers with fists, wisdom, and charisma, commanding screens with Enter the Dragon and leaving producers scrambling to keep up. But while fans saw strength, control, and mastery, behind the scenes, something was unraveling. Lee had been working relentlessly. Between back-to-back filming, writing, business meetings, and training, he pushed his body to its limits. Friends noticed he had lost weight. He complained of headaches and exhaustion. Still, he pressed on. He was determined not just to star in films, but to change them. On the day of his death, Bruce had taken a common pain reliever for a headache. Hours later, he was found unresponsive. When paramedics arrived, there were no signs of trauma. Just a man who looked peacefully asleep, but whose pulse had disappeared. The autopsy revealed cerebral edema, swelling of the brain allegedly triggered by an allergic reaction. The report listed the cause as death by misadventure, a legal term for an accidental, unforeseen outcome. But for fans, and even some close to him, the explanation felt too neat. Speculation took root quickly. Some blamed heat stroke. Others whispered of poison, stress, or ancient curses. Theories ranged from conspiracies to medical oversight, but no single answer has ever fully satisfied the question. How could someone so alive be gone so suddenly? What made Bruce's death so eerie wasn't just its mystery, but its timing. Enter the Dragon, his Hollywood breakthrough, had not yet been released. He never saw the tidal wave of fame that followed, never watched his image become legend. He once said, "The key to immortality is first living a life worth remembering." Bruce Lee didn't just live it, he carved it into stone. And then, like lightning in reverse, he vanished. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckler who couldn't escape himself. In 1938, he was Hollywood. Sword in hand, grin on fire, and a devil-may-care charm that made women swoon and men want to be him. But behind the cloak and dagger, Errol Flynn was already losing control of the man beneath the mask. He became a household name with The Adventures of Robin Hood, his athletic grace and rakish charisma redefining what it meant to be a leading man. Off-screen, though, Flynn lived like a man racing toward a cliff. Fast boats, faster romances, and a personal life riddled with whispered scandals. The public adored the rogue persona. The studios did too, until the off-screen chaos started costing them money. In 1942, Flynn was accused of misconduct by two underage women. The trial was a media circus. Though acquitted, the damage lingered. His box office pull never fully recovered. And from then on, the word reckless followed him like a shadow. He leaned harder into the myth, the hard-drinking, womanizing wild man who laughed at danger. But as the years passed, the laughter dulled. By the 1950s, the roles dried up. His once brilliant face grew gaunt, etched by years of indulgence, and what insiders called a war with the bottle. His final performances felt haunted, slurred lines, shaking hands, and a flicker of that old magic trying to break through the fog. One director said working with Flynn in his later years was like filming a ghost that still wanted to be the hero. He died at 50, collapsed in the arms of a teenage girl in Vancouver. The coroner's report revealed a heart ravaged by years of excess, with the body of a man in his 70s. Found in his suitcase were scripts he'd written himself, still dreaming of a comeback. In the end, Errol Flynn became the very archetype he once played, the flawed rogue who fought valiantly but couldn't outrun his own vices. He swashbuckled through Hollywood with charm and danger, but the sword he carried was double-edged. The real tragedy wasn't that he burned out, it's that he knew it and didn't know how to stop. Peg Entwistle, the girl who fell from the sign. In 1932, her name was supposed to light up marquees. Instead, it was the sign itself that would carry her story. One final climb, one final fall. Peg Entwistle was young, driven, and undeniably talented. Trained on the New York stage, she had that rare kind of classical poise that casting directors adored. When RKO brought her west for a contract, Peg arrived in Hollywood with hope in her eyes, and critics calling her the next big thing. But the city she dreamed of was already unraveling beneath her feet. She was cast in just one film, a small role in 13 Women, and then silence. The studio dropped her. Rumors swirled that her scenes had been cut, or that producers found her too serious for the escapism audiences now craved. Friends said she tried to stay strong, reading scripts in her tiny apartment, waiting for the phone to ring. It never did. On a September evening, Peg left a note on her dresser and walked toward the Hollywoodland sign, the very symbol of dreams. She climbed 50 feet up the giant H and vanished into legend. Her body was discovered days later by a hiker. But what came next only deepened the irony. A letter arrived at her home, a delayed offer for a starring role in a play about a woman driven to madness. Hollywood had finally called, too late. The studios said little. Her death was whispered about, but never confronted. For decades, her story was reduced to a ghost tale, a tragic woman haunting the hills. But the real Peg was more than a headline. She was one of thousands who came to Hollywood with talent, only to be discarded when the camera stopped rolling. Today, the H stands tall again, repaired and reinforced. But Peg's story remains etched into its shadow. It's a chilling reminder that this town, for all its glitter, has never guaranteed happy endings. She didn't die chasing fame. She died after being told she didn't belong, and somehow, that quiet despair still echoes louder than applause. Ramon Novarro, Hollywood's Latin lover, betrayed by his own mask. In 1925, Ramon Novarro was hailed as the next Valentino, dark-eyed, magnetic, and adored by millions. But by 1968, he died alone in his Hollywood Hills home. And the final chapter was anything but romantic. Novarro's rise was meteoric. Born José Ramón Gil Samaniego, he was MGM's exotic heartthrob, the chiseled face of Ben-Hur, and one of the first Latin American stars to break through in white-dominated Hollywood. But behind the velvet curtains of fame, he lived with a fear more crushing than bad reviews, the fear of being outed. In an industry that sold illusion, Novarro's personal life was kept under lock and key. Studio executives, terrified of scandal, tightly controlled his image. Whispers followed him for decades, but Ramon played the game, dressing the part, giving staged interviews, and living a double life that eroded his peace. By the 1960s, the fame had faded, but the mask remained. His home, once buzzing with studio visitors, became a fortress of silence. He kept to himself, quietly supporting his family and clinging to old routines. But one night, a decision made in loneliness ended in tragedy. Two brothers, strangers to the industry, but not to trouble, showed up at his door. Whether it was robbery, rage, or something darker, what happened next was brutal. Ramon was found lifeless the next morning. The home had been ransacked, and the scene raised disturbing questions. It wasn't just the loss of a star, it was a violation of the person he had carefully hidden from the world. In court, the defense tried to twist the narrative, dragging his private life into the spotlight he had long avoided. But the truth remained. Ramon Novarro had been targeted, silenced, and used as spectacle one last time. Hollywood quickly tried to forget him. There was no grand tribute, no sweeping biopic, just whispers, guilt, and a legacy buried beneath shame. But in recent years, that silence has begun to crack. Younger generations now see Novarro not as a cautionary tale, but as a man who carried too much alone. He was a pioneer, one whose real identity never had the safety of a script, and in the end, the tragedy wasn't just how he died, but how long he had to pretend to live. William Desmond Taylor, the gentleman director with a vanishing past. In the early morning hours of February 2nd, 1922, a housekeeper found William Desmond Taylor lying face down in his Los Angeles bungalow. At first glance, it looked peaceful, too peaceful. But when the body was turned over, the truth was clear. Hollywood's most respected director was gone, and the scene was anything but natural. Taylor was a major figure in the silent film era, polished, articulate, and well-liked. He had directed dozens of films and quietly mentored rising stars like Mary Miles Minter. He lived in a modest home, dressed impeccably, and was seen as a gentleman in a town not known for restraint. But his death revealed something else entirely. Police were called, eventually. Strangely, it took over 12 hours for anyone to alert authorities. And when they did arrive, things didn't add up. The initial attending doctor declared the cause of death a stomach hemorrhage, without ever turning over the body. Only after pressure from others was the bullet wound discovered. Then came the unraveling. Taylor, it turned out, wasn't William Desmond Taylor at all. He had been born William Cunningham Dean Tanner, a man who had abandoned a wife and daughter years earlier and disappeared into the shadows, only to re-emerge in Hollywood with a new name, a new accent, and no past. And the suspects? There were plenty. Some pointed to the young starlet who had fallen in love with him. Others whispered about jealous mothers, bitter rivals, and even blackmail. The coroner confirmed a gunshot to the back, but the rest was chaos. Evidence mishandled, statements retracted, records mysteriously lost. The Los Angeles Police Department eventually admitted that all case files from the Taylor investigation vanished sometime in the 1970s. To this day, no one has been officially charged. His death left a gaping hole, not just in Hollywood, but in its moral image. The scandal triggered a moral panic and helped usher in the Hays Code, Hollywood's strict censorship era. A man who had lived with elegance had died in mystery, pulling the entire industry into question. In the end, Taylor's life was like one of his films, romantic, secretive, full of dual identities. Only this time, the final reel was missing. Anna Nicole Smith, the blonde bombshell who drowned in her own fantasy. In the early 2000s, Anna Nicole Smith was impossible to ignore. A Marilyn Monroe look-alike with tabloid magnetism, courtroom chaos, and a voice like sugar-spun fog. But behind the platinum hair and playful smile was a woman slowly being crushed by the weight of her own myth. Born Vicki Lynn Hogan, she grew up far from Hollywood glamour, waitressing at a Texas diner, struggling to pay rent. Her ticket out? A Playboy centerfold in 1992 that catapulted her into superstardom. From there, she became the face of Guess Jeans, the subject of paparazzi obsession, and the bride of an 89-year-old oil tycoon whose fortune sparked a legal battle that would follow her for the rest of her life. When J. Howard Marshall died, Anna expected to inherit a large portion of his estate. But his family fought tooth and nail to shut her out. The years that followed were a carousel of courtrooms, grief, and televised humiliation. She turned to reality TV, inviting the world to laugh at her or pity her. What many missed was the deep loneliness behind her antics. Her final years were marked by loss after loss. In 2006, her 20-year-old son, Daniel, her anchor, died suddenly in her hospital room just days after she gave birth to a daughter. That kind of heartbreak doesn't just settle in the mind. It clings to the bones. Witnesses say she never recovered. In February 2007, Anna Nicole was found unresponsive in a Florida hotel. The cause? A fatal combination of prescription pills. Her system was overwhelmed, her spirit already flickering. She was only 39. The autopsy revealed not just the drugs, but the full picture. Chronic pain, deteriorating health, and years of emotional damage hidden behind the makeup. She had wanted to be Marilyn, adored, immortal, and unbreakable. But like Marilyn, she became a cautionary tale of beauty sold and consumed until there was nothing left. Anna Nicole Smith didn't just chase a dream, she became one. Tragic, surreal, and glittering from a distance. And in the end, it was the fantasy that buried her. They gave us everything, their voices, their faces, their youth, and in return, many were left behind by the very system that made them. If these stories moved you, share your thoughts below. Subscribe to keep their legacies alive, and leave a like to let the algorithm know they're not forgotten. Because sometimes, the only thing louder than silence is remembrance.